Over 3,000 songs, 100 million records, 200 million books donated to children who couldn't afford them. For 60 years, nothing stopped Dolly Parton. Then, in May 2026, she canceled her Las Vegas residency. Dizzy from medication. Her immune system and digestive system both breaking down at once. And quietly carrying something else. The loss of Carl Dean, the man she had been married to for 58 years, who died in March 2025. She described herself as an old classic car, said her doctors raised the hood, and found far more damage than expected. Engine, transmission, shocks, pistons. Then she paused and said the line that stopped the internet cold. Because you know, as well as I know, I cannot lose my spark. What is happening to Dolly Parton right now is not just a health story. It is the moment the strongest woman in country music finally allows herself to be human. How did she get here? And what does it actually cost to give everything? For 60 years straight? To answer that, we have to go back to where it all began. To understand what Dolly Parton is facing today, you have to go back to where she started. Because the woman dealing with health battles and grief in 2026 was forged in a place where hardship was not the exception. It was the address. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, in a one-room cabin on the banks of the Little Pigeon River, in Locust Ridge, Tennessee. She was the fourth of 12 children. 12. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a tobacco farmer who could not read or write. Her mother, Avie Lee, traded the doctor who delivered Dolly a single bag of cornmeal as payment, because that was everything they had. There was no electricity, no running water. The children shared beds and wore clothes sewn from flour sacks. Hunger was not a metaphor in the Parton household. It was a Tuesday. And yet, from that one-room cabin came a voice that would eventually fill arenas on every continent. Dolly discovered music before she discovered most things. By age 7, she was performing at her local church. By 10, she had appeared on Knoxville television. By 13, she had recorded her first single. The mountain could not hold her. The day after she graduated high school in 1964. The very next day, she packed a single bag and took a bus to Nashville. She was 18 years old. She had almost nothing, and she had absolutely everything it took. Before we go further, do you know who Dolly met on her very first day in Nashville? The answer will surprise you. Stay with us. That first day in Nashville, she walked into a laundromat to wash her clothes. A young man named Carl Thomas Dean walked in behind her. He was 23. She was 18. He would later say that the first thing he noticed was that she was, quote, the prettiest thing he had ever seen in his life. They were married 2 years later, in 1966, in a small ceremony with almost no guests. Carl wanted it that way. He was a private man, a road paving contractor who never sought the spotlight, never gave interviews, and spent nearly 60 years being the quiet anchor behind the loudest voice in country music. While Dolly conquered Nashville, then Hollywood, then the entire world, Carl stayed home. He tended his farm. He read his books. He let her be Dolly, and she loved him for it with a ferocity that never dimmed. They were together for 58 years, and when Carl Dean died on March 3, 2025, at the age of 82, something in Dolly Parton's body began to break, in ways that no rhinestone costume could cover. Because some losses do not just break your heart, they break your immune system. They break your sleep. They break the engine that has been running at full throttle for 8 decades. And that is exactly what happened next. For most of 2025, Dolly Parton kept moving. That is what she does. That is what she has always done. When the world gives her a reason to stop, she finds two reasons to keep going. But the body keeps its own calendar. And in the summer of 2025, Dolly's body began sending invoices she could no longer ignore. It started with kidney stones. Not for the first time. Dolly had dealt with them before. But this time, the complications lingered. The pain was manageable. The aftermath was not. Her immune system, already strained by months of grief following Carl's death, began to falter. Her digestive system followed. Two systems that had quietly kept her on stage, in the studio, and in rhinestones for 6 decades, were now, simultaneously, demanding rest. In September 2025, Dolly made the first public acknowledgement that something was wrong. She announced that her Las Vegas residency, 6 shows at the Coliseum at Caesar's Palace, originally scheduled for December 2025, would be postponed. The official reason was health challenges. The details were kept private. She was careful with her words, characteristically warm, characteristically vague about the severity. Have you ever had to cancel something really important because your body simply said no? Drop your story in the comments. You are not alone. But fans noticed. And then, in October 2025, something happened that shook her fan base. Far harder than any official announcement could. Her sister, Dolly Parton, posted on social media that she had been up all night praying for Dolly's health. That single post, raw, unscripted, clearly written from a place of genuine fear, went viral within hours. The internet did what the internet does. Speculation exploded. Rumors cascaded. The word people were too afraid to say out loud began appearing in comment sections everywhere. Dolly responded within days. She posted a video on Instagram, upbeat, sharp-eyed, clearly annoyed at the fuss, and addressed it head-on. She told her fans that she was not as sick as everyone seemed to think. She was working hard, she was fine, and she punctuated the whole thing with a caption that only Dolly Parton could write. "I ain't dead yet." The fans laughed. They breathed. They believed her. Because she was Dolly. And Dolly does not lie to you. But she also missed the Hall of Fame ceremony for the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions in November 2025. The event honoring her own Dollywood, because her doctors told her to take it easy. And she missed the announcement of a new ride at Dollywood that same fall. And she did not tour. And she did not perform. For a woman who had been on stage in some form since she was 7 years old, the silence was deafening. By the time 2026 arrived, the picture was becoming clearer. Not because Dolly was saying more, but because the gaps between her appearances were growing wider. Something was being rebuilt, slowly, carefully, at a cost that only she and her doctors fully understood. And then came March 2026, and the moment she finally let the wall down. There is a difference between a public statement and a public confession. Dolly Parton had been making statements for months, carefully worded, strategically warm, designed to reassure without revealing. But on the opening day of Dollywood's 2026 season, standing in front of the park she had built from scratch in the Tennessee mountains where she was born, something shifted. She did not read from a script. She did not manage the message. She just talked. And what came out was the most honest thing she had said in years. Standing at the microphone for her keynote speech, Dolly told the crowd that she had not been touring, that she had dealt with a few health issues, that her team was taking good care of her. Standard enough. But then she paused and went somewhere deeper. She told them about Carl. She said that the past year had been unlike anything she had experienced before, that losing the man she had shared her life with for nearly 60 years had drained her in ways she had not anticipated. She had thought she would grieve and keep moving, because that is what Dolly Parton does. But grief had other plans. In her own words, she had gotten worn down and worn out, not just emotionally, physically. The kind of exhaustion that gets into your bones and refuses to leave. The kind that no amount of rhinestones or 5-inch heels can disguise. When you are standing alone in a quiet house where someone used to be, Dolly said grief wore her down physically, not just emotionally. Do you believe that losing someone you love can actually make your body sick? Tell us what you think in the comments. She told the crowd she had needed to rebuild herself, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. 3 systems down at once, 3 rebuilds happening simultaneously, at 80 years old. And yet, she was there, standing at Dollywood, smiling, making jokes. When she stood next to Dollywood Company President Eugene Naughton, she told the audience not to mistake him for her new husband. She added that she had absolutely no plans to start dating again. And then she said something that landed like a quiet thunderclap in the room. She said she believed Carl Dean was waiting for her, that if she showed up at the pearly gates with somebody else on her arm, he would not approve. And she laughed. That unmistakable Dolly laugh. But there were tears underneath it that everyone in that crowd could feel. This was not the invincible Dolly. This was not the brand. This was an 80-year-old woman who had loved one man her entire adult life, buried him 14 months earlier, and was still showing up for the people who needed her. The crowd gave her a standing ovation, not for the music, not for the empire, for the courage it takes to stand in front of thousands of people and say, "I was broken, I am rebuilding, and I am still here." On May 4th, 2026, almost exactly 1 year after Carl Dean's passing, Dolly Parton picked up her phone, pointed the camera at herself, and recorded a video that would be seen by millions within hours. She did not have a production team behind her. No lighting rig, no stylist hovering nearby. Just Dolly, speaking directly to the people who loved her, with the kind of plain-spoken honesty that has always been her most underrated superpower. She told them she had good news and bad news. The good news, she said, was that she was responding really well to her medications and treatments, that she was improving every day, that her doctors were excellent and had assured her that everything she was dealing with was treatable. Nothing, she emphasized, was beyond fixing. Then came the bad news. It was going to take a while before she was back at stage performance level, because some of the medications and treatments were making her dizzy. Swimmy-headed, she said, borrowing a phrase from her grandmother. And she could not, she explained with characteristic Dolly logic, be dizzy on stage while carrying banjos and guitars in 5-inch heels. Not to mention, she added with a laugh, all those heavy rhinestone outfits, and the big hair, and what she called her big personality. The Las Vegas residency was canceled. She used a metaphor in this video to describe her body that nobody expected. Can you guess what she compared herself to? The answer is coming up. And it is pure Dolly. But it was not the cancellation that people talked about afterward. It was the metaphor. Dolly described herself as an old classic car. She said that when her doctors raised the hood on this particular antique, they discovered she needed more work than they had initially thought. Her engine needed rebuilding. Her transmission was slipping. Her oil pan was leaking. Her muffler was damaged. Her shocks and pistons needed to be replaced. And then she delivered the line that stopped everyone cold. She said, "Because you know, as well as I know, that I cannot lose my spark. 4 seconds of silence. Then the internet broke. Because in one sentence, casual, funny, completely unrehearsed, Dolly Parton had summarized everything, the whole philosophy, the entire life. A woman who grew up with nothing, who built everything, who lost the person who mattered most, who was now sitting in a body that was demanding repairs she had deferred for decades, and her only concern was keeping the spark alive. She also addressed her immune system and digestive system directly, explaining that kidney stone complications over the past 2 years had sent both systems badly out of balance. Her team, she said, was working hard on rebuilding and strengthening them. And then, in the same breath, she mentioned her Broadway musical, her Nashville museum and hotel, her new recordings, the videos she was still making. Sick, grieving, dizzy from medication, and still working. Some people are built differently. And then there is Dolly Parton, who was apparently built from something the rest of us simply do not have access to. Dolly Parton has been careful not to name a specific diagnosis, and that is her right. But between the details she has shared, the kidney stones, the immune system collapse, the digestive breakdown, the dizziness from medication, the months of physical and emotional exhaustion, a picture emerges that anyone who has ever cared for an aging parent or watched a loved one grieve will recognize immediately. Because what Dolly is describing is not one thing. It is what happens when several things go wrong at once. And the body, after decades of extraordinary output, finally presents the bill. Start with the kidney stones. On their own, they are painful but manageable. Most people recover fully, but recurring kidney stones, and Dolly has dealt with them for years, can quietly damage the kidneys over time, stressing the systems that filter and regulate everything else in the body. When complications arise, the ripple effects can reach far beyond the original problem. Then add grief. This is the part that medicine is only beginning to fully understand. But what research has shown for years is this: grief is not just emotional, it is biological. When you lose someone after nearly 6 decades of daily life together, your nervous system goes into a state of prolonged stress. Cortisol levels rise and stay elevated. Sleep deteriorates. The immune system, which depends heavily on rest and emotional stability, begins to underperform. Inflammation increases throughout the body. Digestive systems, which are exquisitely sensitive to stress hormones, begin to malfunction. Has grief ever made you physically sick? Not just heartbroken, but actually unwell? If you feel comfortable, share your experience below. You might help someone else feel less alone. Dolly lost Carl on March 3, 2025. Within 6 months, her immune system and digestive system were, in her own words, all out of whack. The timeline is not a coincidence. It is a textbook example of what prolonged grief does to a body that is already under physical stress. And then consider the context. Dolly Parton is 80 years old. She has spent more than 60 of those years performing at an intensity that would exhaust someone half her age. Touring, recording, running a theme park, a production company, a foundation. Writing songs at 3 in the morning because the ideas never stop coming. Wearing 5-inch heels on stage when most people her age are focused on not falling on flat ground. The machine has been running at full capacity for 6 decades without a meaningful pause. What her doctors appear to be doing now is not just treating individual symptoms. They are doing what Dolly herself described: rebuilding the engine, addressing the immune system and digestive health simultaneously. managing the medication's side effects carefully enough that she can function and work, while protecting her from the kind of stage exertion that could set everything back. It is slow work. It is unglamorous work. And for a woman who has spent her entire life in motion, it may be the hardest thing she has ever been asked to do. Stand still. Let the body catch up. Trust the process. For Dolly Parton, that is not a medical instruction. That is a spiritual challenge. Here is the thing about Dolly Parton that the health headlines keep accidentally burying. She is not stopped. She is not fading. She is not sitting in a quiet room somewhere waiting for her body to catch up while the world moves on without her. She is, by any reasonable measure, in the middle of the most ambitious, creative period of her life, doing it all from a place of physical limitation that would have retired most people years ago. Let that land for a moment. The woman who just canceled her Las Vegas residency due to dizziness, immune system complications, and digestive breakdown is simultaneously finishing a Broadway musical, opening a museum and hotel in Nashville, recording new music, and producing content from home. At 80 years old, while grieving, while on medication that makes her head swim. Most people slow down when they get sick. Dolly added a Broadway show, a museum, and a hotel. Do you think that kind of drive is a gift? Or does it come with a cost nobody talks about? Keep watching, because the answer might surprise you. Start with the Broadway musical. Dolly. A true original musical is scheduled to open in New York later in 2026. Fall or early winter, depending on final production timelines. Dolly has described herself as actively rewriting and reworking the show, not as a passive creative consultant, but as a hands-on collaborator who is shaping the narrative, the music, and the message of a production that will introduce her story to a generation that may know her name without fully knowing her life. Then there is the Nashville Museum and Hotel, a project years in the making that is finally nearing its opening. For Dolly, this is deeply personal. Nashville is where she arrived at 18 with a single bag and a voice that had nowhere to go but up. Building a permanent home for her story in that city is not a vanity project. It is a closing of a circle that began in a one-room cabin on the Little Pigeon River. She is also recording. Songs are being written and laid down even during recovery. Because for Dolly Parton, the music has never been a career choice. It is a biological function. She has said before that she wakes up in the middle of the night with melodies she has to capture before they disappear. That does not stop because the body is tired. If anything, when everything else is stripped away, the songs come faster, and through all of it. Dollywood continues. The park that opened in 1986, that carries her name, that employs thousands of people in the Tennessee mountains where she grew up poor, is in its 41st season. It runs, it grows, it endures. This is what Dolly Parton looks like when she slows down, which raises a question that her closest observers have been quietly asking for months. Not whether she will recover. Her doctors say she will. But whether the woman who built an empire on relentless forward motion will ever truly allow herself the rest that recovery actually requires. Because building a Broadway show is not resting. Opening a museum is not resting. And Dolly Parton has never been very good at doing nothing, even when nothing is exactly what her body is asking for. There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. Country legend gets sick, cancels shows, recovers, returns, the end. But that version misses everything that matters. Because what is happening to Dolly Parton in 2026 is not just a health update. It is a reckoning with something that has been building for 60 years. The accumulated cost of being, without interruption, one of the most giving human beings the entertainment industry has ever produced. Think about what that actually means. Dolly Parton has never had an era of purely taking. She has always been pouring out into the music, into the performances, into the fans who line up for hours just to be in the same room as her energy, into the imagination library, which she has funded personally since 1995, and which has now delivered over 200 million books to children in 14 countries. Into Dollywood, which gave an entire region of Appalachia an economic identity and a source of pride. Into the people around her, the band members, the crew, the songwriters she championed when nobody else would listen. For 60 years, the cup has been pouring. And somewhere along the way, the question of who refills it got quietly skipped over. Do you think Dolly should fully step back from work and focus entirely on her health? Or do you believe that staying creative is actually part of her healing? Team rest or team create? Tell us below. Carl Dean was part of the answer to that question. For 58 years, he was the one who refilled her. The quiet man at home who had no interest in her fame, who saw through the wigs and the rhinestones to the girl from Locust Ridge, who loved her not because of what she produced, but because of who she was when the cameras were off. When Carl died, that refilling stopped. And the cup, already running lower than anyone outside her inner circle knew, began to empty faster than her body could compensate. This is the weight of the crown that nobody photographs. The loneliness at the center of a life spent making everyone else feel less alone. The physical toll of decades of generosity so consistent it became invisible. The grief of losing the one person who knew the difference between Dolly the legend and Dolly the woman, and chose the woman every single time. At 80, she is carrying all of it: the history, the loss, the medication, the dizziness, the empire that keeps expanding even as the body requests contraction. And she is carrying it, characteristically, with humor and grace, and a classic car metaphor that made the whole world laugh and cry at the same time. But behind the laugh is a woman who has given more than most people will ever be asked to give, who is now, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, being asked to receive, to accept care instead of provide it, to let the doctors work, to let the body rest, to let the people who love her back, without her having to perform for it. That is not a small thing. For someone like Dolly Parton, that may be the greatest challenge she has ever faced. There is a moment in Dolly Parton's May 2026 Instagram video that lasts exactly 3 seconds. She has just finished describing herself as an old classic car. Engine rebuilding, transmission slipping, shocks being replaced, and she pauses, just for a beat. And then she says, quietly, almost to herself, "Because you know, as well as I know, that I cannot lose my spark." 3 seconds. 30 years of philosophy compressed into a single sentence. This is what Dolly Parton is teaching us right now. Not from a stage, not in rhinestones, not with a band behind her and 50,000 people screaming her name, but from a phone camera in an ordinary room, with medication making her head swim and grief still fresh in her chest. She is teaching us that slowing down is not the same as stopping, that a body asking for rest is not a body giving up, that the most courageous thing a person who has spent their entire life being strong for others can do is finally, quietly, allow themselves to be cared for. If Dolly Parton herself told you it was okay to slow down and rebuild, would you finally give yourself permission to do it? Drop a yes or a no in the comments. You might be surprised how many people feel exactly the same way. Dolly Parton was born in a one-room cabin with no electricity and no running water. She stood on street corners in Nashville at 18 with nothing but a voice and a refusal to be invisible. She wrote, "I will always love you" as an act of professional defiance, and turned it into one of the most recognizable songs in human history. She built a theme park in the mountains where she grew up poor, and gave that region an identity it had never had before. She gave 200 million books to children whose parents could not afford them. She loved one quiet man for 60 years and buried him with words she said were not enough. And now, at 80, with her immune system rebuilding and her digestive system recovering, and her doctors telling her everything is treatable, she is writing a Broadway show, opening a museum, recording songs at 3 in the morning because the melodies do not stop just because the body is tired. The spark is not gone. The spark is the one thing they cannot fix, because the spark was never broken. What is happening to Dolly Parton right now is hard to watch. Because we love her. Because she has been the soundtrack to so many of our lives for so long, that the thought of her being fragile feels like the world itself becoming fragile. But here is what her story is actually saying. If you listen carefully enough, even the strongest engines need to be rebuilt sometimes. Even the brightest sparks need oxygen to keep burning. Even legends, especially legends, are allowed to be human. Dolly Parton is not fading. She is being restored. And if her whole life is any indication, once restored, she will be better than ever. If this story moved you, leave a tribute for Dolly in the comments below. And if you believe that some sparks are simply impossible to extinguish, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you every week.